Welcome back, everyone. That break, it felt like forever. And like no time had passed at all. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. It's always strange how time works at these things.
Right. But we're back and ready to dig in something that's been causing quite a stir, in the Proxmox world at least.
Oh, yeah.
It's this whole debate about DMZs. When you're building a secure Proxmox router,
hmm
is a DMZ like a must-have? Or are there other ways to get the same level of security, without the DMZ?
Ah, I see. The DMZ dilemma.
Exactly. And we've been combing through tons of discussions and real-world setups from the Proxmox community. It's a real mix of opinions.
I bet. There's rarely a one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to network security.
So true. And that's precisely what we're aiming for in this deep dive,
hmm
to help you navigate this whole DMZ debate. Not to tell you what's right or wrong, but to give you the information you need so you can make the best choice for your own setup.
I like it, empowering people with knowledge.
Right. So before we get lost in the weeds of DMZs, let's take a step back. Let's paint a picture. What are most people trying to achieve when they build a Proxmox-based network?
The sources we've been looking at, well, they all seem to point to a couple of key things. First, modularity. People want a setup that can handle their local servers without breaking a sweat. Whether it's for personal projects, business needs, you name it.
Makes sense. You want your network to be adaptable.
Right. And the second big one is security, robust security. It's about creating this network that can grow and evolve, but also has those layers of protection, to keep everything safe and sound.
Security and flexibility. Two essential ingredients in any modern network, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
And that's where our friend the DMZ comes in. For anyone who might be new to the concept, could you break down what a DMZ actually is and how it fits into this whole picture?
Sure. So imagine a DMZ, which stands for demilitarized zone, by the way, like a buffer zone. It's a separate network segment, sits between your internal network and the Wild West of the internet.
Okay, so it's like a security checkpoint before you get to the main network.
Exactly. You put specific services in this DMZ, things like a web server or an email server, the things that need to be accessible from the outside world. But your internal network with all your sensitive data, that stays tucked away, safe behind the firewall.
Okay, starting to get the picture. Extra layer of separation, like a moat around a castle.
Exactly. A digital moat.
But here's a question that popped up a lot in those community discussions, and it's something I've wondered about myself. With all the fancy firewalls and things we have these days, like VLANs,
Yeah, VLANs.
couldn't you achieve that same kind of isolation without having to set up a whole separate DMZ?
That, my friend, is the heart of the debate. And you know what? Both sides have some pretty compelling points.
Okay, let's hear it. Lay it on me. Why do people advocate for using a DMZ in the first place?
Well, the biggest reason that kept popping up was enhanced isolation. I mean, think about it. That extra layer of separation can really limit the damage if something in the DMZ gets compromised.
Right, so it's about containing the threat.
Yeah, like even if an attacker gets through that outer wall, they still have to work their way through those inner defenses to get to your really valuable stuff.
Multiple layers of security. I can see why that would be appealing, especially if you're dealing with sensitive information.
Oh, absolutely. And on top of that, setting up a DMZ in Proxmox, well, it's not exactly rocket science. Relatively straightforward, you could say. Plus, you have a lot of control over who and what can access things in that DMZ. It's all about fine-tuning your security, right?
So you're in the driver's seat. Sounds pretty good so far. But I know there's a counter-argument. What are the downsides? Why wouldn't someone want to use a DMZ?
Well, the big one is complexity. You're essentially adding another network to manage. More moving parts, more configurations, more potential headaches.
Right, so more maintenance, more things that could go wrong.
Yeah, and some folks argue that with a really good firewall and some clever VLAN configurations, you can get similar levels of security without all that extra hassle.
So it's a balancing act, weighing that robust isolation against the potential for, well, network chaos.
Pretty much. And the best approach often depends on the size and nature of your network.
Right, makes sense. Now, before we dive into the nitty-gritty of what the Proxmox community suggests, let's talk VLANs for a second. They keep coming up in these discussions. What's the deal with VLANs?
VLANs are cool because they let you segment your network logically without needing a bunch of physical hardware for each segment.
Wait, so it's like creating virtual walls within your network.
I got it. Say you have your general LAN, right? That's where all your everyday devices connect. But then you could have a separate VLAN that acts like a DMZ. And maybe another one for sensitive servers or for guests.
So it's like having multiple mini networks all within your main network.
Exactly. And your firewall enforces all the rules, so even if someone gets into one VLAN, they can't just waltz into the others. That's the beauty of it.
Okay, so it's like those layers of security again, but virtual this time. So then, where does the line get blurry between a traditional DMZ and a really well-organized VLAN setup?
Ah, that's the million-dollar question. It becomes less about physical separation and more about how you're controlling access and dividing up your network. It gets nuanced.
Nuance is good. Keeps things interesting. And speaking of interesting, we've got a whole pile of specific recommendations to go through from the Proxmox community themselves. Real-world tips, tools, the good stuff.
The practical wisdom, ready to dive in.
Let's do it. But before we go full-on techie, let's take a little breather. When we come back, we'll unpack those recommendations and see how they fit into both the DMZ and the DMZ-less approaches. Stay tuned.
All right, welcome back. Hope you've got your thinking caps on because we're about to get into the nuts and bolts of building a secure Proxmox router.
You know, I love getting into the details. We've talked about DMZs and VLANs in theory. But now, let's get practical. What's the Proxmox community saying? What tools and tricks do they actually use?
Okay, so let's start with the foundation of any good secure network setup, the firewall.
Ah, yes, the trusty firewall. Can't live without it.
Right. And when it comes to Proxmox routers, the sources we've been looking at, they consistently point to two main contenders, pfSense and OPNsense.
Okay, pfSense, OPNsense. I've heard those names thrown around. What makes them so special?
Well, they're both packed with features. I'm talking intrusion detection and prevention, network address translation, robust VPN support. It's like having a whole security team guarding your network.
Wow, sounds pretty impressive. So in a typical setup, you'd have dedicated interfaces on the firewall for the WAN, the LAN, and maybe a DMZ if you're going that route.
Exactly. But here's the key takeaway. Even if you decide to skip the dedicated DMZ, these firewalls are still crucial for managing traffic between your VLANs. It's all about control, whether you've got a physical DMZ or not.
So the firewall becomes the brain of your network segmentation. I like it.
Right, it's all connected.
Speaking of connections, another topic that kept popping up was WireGuard.
WireGuard. It's all the rage these days.
For good reason, it seems. What's the deal with WireGuard and Proxmox? Why is everyone so excited about it?
Well, for starters, it's known for being fast, lightweight, and relatively easy to set up, even if you're not a network engineer. And the general consensus is, host your WireGuard server directly on your firewall.
Okay, so keep everything centralized. Makes sense. Plus, I bet that gives you more control over who can access what, even when they're connecting remotely.
You got it. You can restrict WireGuard clients to specific VLANs or subnets. That way, even remote users only get access to the resources they absolutely need.
Love that. Security without sacrificing flexibility. Now let's move on to another piece of the puzzle. Reverse proxies. They're often recommended for web servers, but how do they fit into the whole Proxmox security picture?
Okay, so a reverse proxy, think of it like a gatekeeper for your web servers. It sits in front of them and handles all those incoming requests from the internet.
So it's like a bouncer at a club, checking IDs before letting anyone in.
Pretty much. It adds a layer of security because your actual web servers are hidden from direct exposure. Plus, reverse proxies can do things like load balancing, which distributes traffic across multiple servers, and they can handle SSL termination, which is super important for encrypting communication between your website and your users.
So it's like a multi-talented security guard. Now, I've seen HAProxy mentioned a lot in these Proxmox discussions. Is that the go-to reverse proxy?
HAProxy is definitely popular. It's powerful, flexible, and known for its performance. But there are other options too, like Trafic and Caddy. They get a lot of praise for being user-friendly.
Options are good. Gives people the flexibility to choose what works best for them. Okay, so we've covered firewalls, VLANs, VPNs with WireGuard, and reverse proxies. Anything else specific to Proxmox that people should keep in mind?
When it comes to actually configuring Proxmox itself, the experts highlight a few best practices. First up, use separate virtual bridges for WAN, DMZ, and LAN traffic.
Right, because even though we're talking about virtual networks, you still want to keep those traffic streams separate, just like you would with physical cables.
Exactly. And another common tip is to use PCI passthrough, especially for your WAN interface. This means you're basically giving your firewall VM direct access to your physical network card.
And that translates to better performance, less lag.
You got it.
Yeah.
Plus, it can actually enhance security by reducing the attack surface within that virtual environment. You're cutting out the middleman.
Streamlining the connection makes sense. And of course, let's not forget about securing the Proxmox management interface itself. You don't want just anyone messing around with your hypervisor settings.
Absolutely not. The advice from the community is clear. Restrict access to that management interface. Only allow connections from internal networks or VPNs. You can even set up a dedicated VLAN just for management traffic if you want to be extra cautious.
Okay, so we've got our firewall, our VLANs, our VPN set up with WireGuard, and our reverse proxy all configured according to the Proxmox community's wisdom. But let's circle back to that big question. Are these DMZ alternatives enough? Or do you absolutely need a dedicated DMZ for maximum security?
The age-old question. And you know what? It really depends. There's no single right answer. It all comes down to your specific needs and how comfortable you are managing all these different tools.
Okay, so let's break it down then. What factors should people consider when making this decision? Walk us through it.
Sure. So first things first, the size and complexity of your network. Are we talking about a small home lab or a large organization with tons of services and sensitive data?
Right, so for a simple home setup, a well-configured firewall and some VLAN magic might be more than enough. But as things get more complex, that's where a dedicated DMZ starts to look more appealing.
Exactly. And then there's your own comfort level with configuration and maintenance. Managing a DMZ effectively requires a good understanding of networking concepts.
Firewall rules, routing, maybe even intrusion detection systems. If you're not already familiar with those things, it's going to be a bit of a learning curve.
And let's be honest, a misconfigured DMZ can actually make things worse instead of better. So you really have to be honest with yourself about your technical skills and how much time you're willing to invest in keeping things running smoothly.
It's about finding that balance between security and manageability.
Right. Now, another important factor is your risk tolerance. How much risk are you willing to accept? Because let's be real, no security setup is perfect. But a DMZ does add that extra layer of protection. It can limit the damage if something does get compromised.
So it's like a damage control system.
Exactly. So if minimizing the impact of a potential attack is your top priority, a DMZ might be worth the extra effort. But if you're more focused on keeping things simple and manageable and you're dealing with a smaller network, well-configured VLANs might be all you need.
It's all about weighing those pros and cons, thinking about your individual needs.
Precisely. To make this all a bit more concrete, maybe we can walk through a couple of real-world examples.
Love that idea. Let's get specific. Let's say you're a small business owner. You've got a website, an email server, and a couple of internal file servers. Would you recommend a DMZ in that case?
Probably not. In that scenario, a dedicated DMZ might be overkill, especially if you're comfortable working with VLANs and firewall rules. You could create a VLAN specifically for those public-facing services like the website and email. Then your firewall would be set up to allow traffic from the internet to reach that VLAN, but nothing else.
So anyone trying to get to your website or email would hit the firewall first, and only those specific requests would be allowed through. And you could even segment things further within that VLAN if you wanted to.
Exactly. You could have separate subnets for the web server and email server for an extra layer of isolation. And of course, your main LAN, where your file servers and workstations live, would be completely separate from that public-facing VLAN.
Okay, so even if someone did manage to break into your web server, they'd still be contained within that VLAN. They couldn't access the rest of your network.
Exactly. Now let's imagine a bigger scenario, a larger organization. Maybe they have multiple web applications, a database server, and a development environment. In that case, a DMZ might be a good idea.
Okay, so the stakes are higher, the network is more complex, the data is more sensitive.
Right. You could put those public-facing web applications in the DMZ totally separate from everything else.
Yeah.
Then your database server could be on its own VLAN, only accessible from within the DMZ. That way, even if someone got into one of the web apps, they couldn't just hop over to your precious data. And your development environment, that could also be on a separate VLAN. You're basically minimizing the potential damage at every step.
It's like a fortress, multiple layers of defense. The DMZ is the outer wall, and then those VLANs are like the inner chambers, protecting the crown jewels.
That's a great way to put it. And don't forget, all those Proxmox best practices we talked about earlier, those apply regardless of whether you go with a DMZ or VLANs. Separate virtual bridges, PCI pass-through, securing that management interface, all essential for building a strong foundation.
Like building a house.
Yeah.
Right. The foundation has to be solid no matter what kind of fancy roof you put on top.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave everyone with this. In the world of cybersecurity, things are always changing. So stay curious. Research, experiment, and adjust your setup as needed. Don't be afraid to reach out to the Proxmox community for help and advice.
There's a wealth of knowledge and experience out there. Share what you know, learn from others, because at the end of the day, a secure network is a collaborative effort.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, folks, we hope this deep dive has given you the knowledge and the tools you need to make smart decisions about your Proxmox security.
And remember, whether you choose a DMZ or decide to go another route, the key is to stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep those networks safe.
Until next time.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. DMZs, VLANs, all those tools the Proxmox community loves. It's been a wild ride.
And now, the moment of truth. Time to decide. Are those DMZ alternatives enough? Or do you really need a separate DMZ for, like, ultimate security?
The million-dollar question. And I know everyone's waiting for the answer.
Well, there's no easy answer. It all comes down to your specific situation. What are your needs? How comfortable are you with all this technical stuff?
Right. No one-size-fits-all solution. So what are the key things people should be thinking about when making this decision?
Okay, first up, how big and complex is your network? Are we talking about a little home lab or a massive organization with tons of servers and sensitive data?
Okay, so for a small setup, VLANs and a good firewall might be all you need. But as things grow, as the data gets more important, that's when a DMZ starts to make more sense.
Exactly. You need those extra layers of protection. That DMZ acts like a buffer, contains the threat if something gets compromised.
Right, like damage control. But of course, more security often means more complexity.
Exactly. And that brings us to the next factor, your comfort level with all the technical stuff. Managing a DMZ, well, it's not for the faint of heart.
Firewall rules, routing, intrusion detection systems, it can get pretty intense.
Right. And if you're not careful, a misconfigured DMZ can actually make things worse. So be honest with yourself. How comfortable are you with all these tools? How much time are you willing to spend managing things?
Finding that balance, security versus manageability.
Exactly. Now, another thing to consider, your risk tolerance. How much risk are you willing to accept? Because no matter how secure you make things, there's always some risk.
True. You can't eliminate risk entirely.
Right.
But you can mitigate it.
Right. And a DMZ can definitely help with that. It reduces the potential damage if a breach does happen.
So it's like an insurance policy.
Kind of. If minimizing the impact of an attack is your top priority, a DMZ might be the way to go. But if you value simplicity and ease of use and you're working with a smaller network, well-configured VLANs might be enough.
It's all about weighing those pros and cons, making the decision that's right for you. To make this a bit more real, maybe we can walk through some examples.
Sure, let's do it. Let's say you're running a small business. You've got a website, an email server, a couple of internal file servers. What would you do, DMZ or no DMZ?
Okay, in that case, I think I'd lean towards no DMZ, especially if I was comfortable with VLANs and firewall rules. You could create a VLAN just for those public-facing services, the website and email, then use a firewall to control the traffic. Only allow requests specifically for those services.
Yeah, exactly. And you could even segment things further within that VLAN. Separate subnets for the web server and email server. Add an extra layer of isolation.
And of course, the internal LAN with the file servers and workstations, that would be completely separate. So even if someone did get into the web server, they'd be stuck in that VLAN. Couldn't access the rest of the network.
Right. Now, let's switch gears. Imagine a bigger organization. Multiple web applications, a database server, a development environment, more moving parts. More sensitive data.
Okay, yeah. In that case, a DMZ starts to make a lot more sense.
Definitely. You could put those web apps in the DMZ, keep them away from everything else. The database server, that could be on its own VLAN, accessible only from within the DMZ. And the development environment, that could also be isolated on its own VLAN. You're minimizing the risk at every level.
It's like a multi-layered defense system. The DMZ is the first line of defense, and then those VLANs protect the really important stuff.
You got it. And remember, all those best practices we talked about earlier, separate virtual bridges, PCI pass-through, securing the Proxmox management interface, those apply no matter what, DMZ or no DMZ. You need a solid foundation.
Like building a house. The foundation has to be strong no matter what you build on top of it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, folks, that's a wrap for our deep dive into DMZs and Proxmox security. We hope you found it helpful.
And remember, whether you go the DMZ or choose another approach, the key is to stay informed. Keep learning. The Proxmox community is a great resource. Don't be afraid to ask questions, share your experiences.
Because in the end, building a secure network, well, it's a team effort. We all learn from each other. We all help each other stay safe. So until next time, Stay curious, stay secure, and keep those networks running smoothly.
See y'all next time.